Hi everybody, welcome back to Moral Psychology with me, Dr. Josh Redstone, and today we're going to be looking at the second chapter from our textbook, all about multi-system moral psychology. So this chapter by Fiery Cushman, Leanne Young, and Joshua Greene is really interesting because it's very interdisciplinary. As we'll see, we're going to be talking about not just moral theoretic frameworks like deontology or consequentialism, but also some really interesting findings from neuroscience. And we're going to learn about how our moral psychology, our moral reasoning, the mental machinery that we use to make moral judgments, essentially, is subserved by more than one neural system. And this is really interesting to me, and I hope that it's interesting for you as well. So, let's get into it. All right, so the authors of this chapter kick things off by noting just how exciting a time this is for moral philosophy. And the reason why it's an exciting time, according to our authors here, is because there are disparate moral and ethical frameworks which are now beginning to show signs of reconciliation. As we'll see, what they have in mind here are moral ethical frameworks like consequentialism on the one hand or deontology on the other hand. These are quite disparate accounts. For example, sentimentalism and Kantian rationalism. Kant, being a deontologist, was of course emphatic about the goodwill and reasoning about what is right and wrong by using very precise formulations of moral norms, like the different formulations of the categorical imperative, whereas sentimentalist thinkers like David Hume or Adam Smith would have argued that our moral judgments are really a result of the sentiments or the emotions, and in the case of moral judgments, particularly moral emotions, things like disgust or guilt or shame or things like that. Anyway, all of these disparate moral ethical frameworks are beginning to show signs of reconciliation because of what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and that is the finding, or at least what the findings suggest about the nature of all of this moral mental machinery, is that our moral psychology is underwritten by more than one psychological system, or more than one information processing system in the brain, if you like. So, just to kind of pick up from, a more specific example of this disparity that's now beginning to go away thanks to this kind of interdisciplinary work. Think about the fact that for a long time, and this is discussed in the opening of this chapter, for a long time, it's been thought that moral development is primarily cognitive. That is to say, we make the moral judgments that we do rationally or deliberatively or consciously. So it's cognitive in the sense that we're thinking about it, right? We have to apply principles, make judgments on that basis. Like applying the categorical imperative. If you're going to do, say, the switch case, if you're going to answer about the switch case variant of the trolley problem or the Footbridge case of the trolley problem, perhaps in both cases you might say that it's wrong to pull the switch or push the large person off the bridge, because if you're reading or if you're reasoning from something like the categorical imperative, that will be wrong in both of those cases. But in recent years, a couple of challenges have arisen against this view that our moral, not only our moral psychology in general, but our moral development is a cognitive process, like learning and internalizing rules and so on and so forth. One of these challenges we could call the intuitive challenge, and the other we'll call the affective challenge, following the authors of the textbook. So, what is the intuitive challenge? Well, the intuitive challenge basically is meant to capture this idea that moral judgment is actually accomplished by rapid, automatic, unconscious psychological processes. And this is what we mean, like when philosophers and cognitive scientists talk about intuitions. We don't mean some kind of wishy-washy, spooky, magical power kind of thing, right? We simply mean a rapid, automatic, unconscious judgment, for example, a gut feeling. That's intuition. The affective challenge, on the other hand, says that moral judgment is primarily driven by affective responses. And here, affect refers to mood and emotion. So the sentimentalists that I mentioned a moment ago, like David Hume or Adam Smith, would feel quite sympathetic to the affective challenge because they would have argued, well, they did argue very much the same thing. Our moral judgments are driven primarily by the sentiments. So what we would today call moral emotions like compassion, guilt, shame, so on and so forth. And we'll talk more about the moral emotions as the course unfolds. So even if these intuitive or active or affective mechanisms play some kind of role in our moral judgment, they certainly don't tell the whole story. I mean, even if it's true that one or both of these challenges to the, we'll call the cognitive view of moral development, turns out to be true, well, we still appeal to rules. Here I'm talking about like moral norms, perhaps even conventional norms, different ethical theories, principles like the categorical imperative. We have beliefs about what's right and wrong, right? I mean, we still appeal to these things that seem quite cognitive in nature. We'll even do this after we've made a somewhat intuitive moral judgment. If I were to put to you some kind of moral quandary, and you answered on the basis of a gut feeling, you might then, after that, come up with a reason to explain why you made the judgment you did. So, for example, if I say to you, just go ahead and shoplift that chocolate bar at the grocery store, you might have a gut feeling that that's wrong. And of course, if I were to press you on why you didn't steal the chocolate bar, you might say, well, you might appeal to this feeling, but probably you'd appeal to a principle instead, like stealing is wrong, rather than appealing directly to the gut feeling or gut reaction you had in that situation, even though it's arguable that that gut reaction is really where your moral motivation not to steal has come from in that situation. So we've got this intuitive, affective kind of challenge going on. So we've got essentially a challenge to the cognitive account of moral psychology that goes something like this. We think of our moral cognition as something very rational, or at least a lot of thinkers do. Yet the intuitive challenge is very present there, has been for a long time. And likewise with the affective challenge to what we might call a cognitive account of moral psychology. So on the one hand, we've got this cognitive, rational, we're rational animals kind of view of moral cognition. And on the other, we have these affective and intuitive challenges. How can we reconcile all of this together? Well, that's what this chapter is all about. They can be reconciled because we're beginning to see, thanks to findings in neuroscience, that our moral psychology is subserved by more than one system. Indeed, as we'll see, these affective and intuitive components can even work in concert with our more rational, deliberative kinds of moral psychology. And I think that's really interesting, and I'm really excited to talk about it. But first, before we get to the nuts and bolts of all of this stuff, I want to talk a little bit about dual process models more generally. So, to give an example of a dual process model, what a dual process model is, I thought I would talk briefly about the dual visual system hypothesis, which goes back to the work of Milner and Goodale in the early 90s, and even earlier to the work of Ungerleider and Mishkin in the 1980s. Basically, the dual visual system hypothesis states that we actually have two visual systems in the brain, rather than one. There's a dorsal stream and a ventral stream. Dorsal just means on the top of, and ventral means on the bottom of. So we have these two visual systems in the brain that actually subserve different aspects of vision. So let's say, to make this a little more concrete, I want to reach over and pick up my coffee cup. So, like so. Now, you might think that reaching out and picking up that coffee cup is subserved by a single visual system. Information comes in to the brain from the optic nerves. It goes to the occipital cortex, which is where our early visual areas are. And from there, it makes its way to wherever it needs to go, perhaps the motor cortex to move my arm and pick up the cup. But that's actually not how it works. Actually, what happens is that once the information from the optic nerves reaches the occipital lobe, it's split into two different streams. The ventral stream, the stream that goes through information processing areas in the brain on the ventral axis, is known as the what pathway, and it plays a role in object recognition and object identification. So if I look at this cup here and I say, what is that? Well, that's a coffee cup. I'm having a phenomenal visual experience of the cup. I'm perceiving the cup. I have a mental representation of this coffee cup. Well, that is subserved by the ventral stream. But when it comes to actually reaching out and picking the cup up, am I relying on my phenomenal experience of where the cup is? In other words, is my visual phenomenal representation of the cup that I am conscious of what's guiding my action when I reach out and grab it? No, it's actually not. The dorsal stream is what underwrites that ability. That's why it's called the where pathway. So locating objects in our immediate spatial environment and coordinating our movements so that we can interact with them is subserved by the dorsal visual stream, or the dorsal pathway. So even though it seems like I'm seeing the cup and that is what is guiding my hand here, that's actually not what's going on. And an interesting fact is the dorsal visual stream is actually unconscious. And this is demonstrated very nicely by a phenomenon known as blind sight. And I will link a video about blind sight in the description somewhere here, because it's very interesting. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into it today. But that's an example of a dual process model of vision. Vision is subserved by more than one system. So I have my conscious what pathway, my ventral pathway, which allows me to say that's a coffee cup. And I have my unconscious dorsal pathway, which is what enables me to actually reach out and pick it up and take a sip. So vision and action is actually subserved by more than one system. And the same is true of our auditory system, and the same may be true of our moral psychological system, as we're about to see. All right, so what would a dual process model of moral judgment look like? Well, think back to the trolley scenarios that I discussed in a previous lecture. And some of you answered what you would do in those various scenarios, particularly the switch case and the footbridge case. Remember, the switch case is the case where we have a trolley speeding down a track heading toward 5 people, and you're standing beside a switch which you can pull that will divert the trolley to another track where one innocent person is standing. You'll save the 5 people, but the one person will surely die if you pull the switch. The footbridge case is very similar, only instead of a switch, you're standing on a bridge over the track, and there's a very large person beside you, and if you push that person off the bridge onto the track, he'll stop the trolley from killing the 5 people, but he'll also die. So in each case, the outcome is the same. You have the opportunity to save 5 lives at the expense of 1 life, or to do nothing and let 5 people die. And yet, people give different answers, even though the outcome is the same in each of these scenarios. So people will, for example, agree that it's not okay to push the person off the bridge in the case of the footbridge case, but people will agree that it is all right to pull the switch and divert the trolley to the track with 1 innocent person on it. So what exactly is going on here? Well, Joshua Greene and his colleagues have observed that people seem to be using consequentialist reasoning when it comes to the switch case, whereas people are employing deontological reasoning in the push case. Why is one set of responses considered consequentialist and the other deontological, though? And why is one response favored in one scenario and the different response favored in the other scenario? That's a difficult question to answer, but Joshua Greene and his colleagues have hypothesized that harming somebody in a personal way, that is, pushing the large person off of the bridge in the footbridge version of the trolley problem, triggers some kind of emotional alarm bell. This could be just because it's personal in the sense that you're standing beside the person and you're directly harming the person rather than indirectly pushing the switch. Or it could also be because physical contact is involved. We're not really sure why. But in any case, this is what Greene hypothesizes, is that there's this emotional alarm bell in the Footbridge case that overrides any consequentialist judgment that you might have made. For example, kill one to save five. Well, on a consequentialist reading, that's morally acceptable. It's okay to save the five at the expense of the one because you'd be increasing utility that way, right? If we're taking a sort of classic utilitarian view of this stuff. In the switch case, of course, there's no emotional alarm bell because it's impersonal. You're just pulling a switch, right? So this might be the reason why people's judgments about what's permissible is different in the switch case and the Footbridge case, because one is impersonal, the switch case, and the other is personal, that one being the Footbridge case. Now, what makes all of this dual process kind of account of moral psychology? Well, Greene and his colleagues think that these discrepant judgments don't come from one psychological system. They think they're a result of different psychological systems. Sometimes these systems compete, but sometimes they work in concert with one another. But the really cool part is all of this is empirically testable, thanks to neuroscience and psychology and that kind of thing. So we can actually try and see what's going on in which areas of the brain when people are engaging in consequentialist judgments, deontological judgments, or when people are thinking about personal and impersonal cases, or cases where harm is a means to an end versus when it's a side effect of achieving a certain end, so on and so forth. So, if we're going to follow Greene here and the rest of the authors of this chapter, then we will think of these different kinds of possible moral psychological systems as responding to personal and impersonal dilemmas differently. So maybe we have a system that responds to personal dilemmas in such and such a way, and a system that responds to impersonal dilemmas in such and such a way. Personal dilemmas, of course, would be analogous to things like the push case, and impersonal ones would be analogous to things like the switch case. Joshua Greene and his colleagues used functional magnetic resonance imaging to examine whether regions of the brain that are associated with emotion processing. So if we look at an fMRI machine and we see different bits of the brain lighting up, I hate that term, but we see higher levels of activity in regions of the brain that are associated with emotional processing. Let's see if those brain regions exhibit increased activity when we present people with personal moral dilemmas. So what are some of the brain regions of interest here? Well, regions of the medial prefrontal cortex. Those are a big one. Some of you, for example, may have heard of a case, the case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a 19th century railway worker. Due to an accident with some blasting powder in a tamping iron, they used to have to drill these holes and tamp down their dynamite or TNT with these big tamping irons when they were blasting to lay down railway tracks. And this is what Phineas Gage was doing. When an accident occurred, basically the explosives went off and drove this big long tamping iron through his skull. Now, Gage survived this, but his moral behavior became severely disordered after this. And one of the brain regions that was very, very damaged in this accident, in the case of Phineas Gage, was the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is kind of a textbook example of an area of the brain that we might want to look at here, because it seems to be implicated in, if not strictly speaking, emotion processing, at least moral processing, or moral psychological processing, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Now, to take the opposite spin, Greene and colleagues also looked at regions of the brain that are associated with controlled, conscious, deliberative kinds of tasks. So functions like working memory or abstract reasoning. And they looked and they found that brain regions that involve these kinds of information processing functions tend to be more active when we're confronted with impersonal moral dilemmas, like the switch case. So following up on these observations, Greene and his colleagues decided to look a little deeper. Okay, so Greene and his colleagues have found that personal dilemmas, like the push case or the Footbridge case, tend to elicit higher activity in brain regions that are associated with emotion processing, like the medial prefrontal cortex. On the other hand, they found that impersonal dilemmas, like the switch case, tend to elicit processing that's associated with conscious, deliberative processes, like working memory and that kind of thing. So how did they follow up on all of this? Well, they designed another study where, instead of examining patterns of neural activity associated with personal versus impersonal dilemmas, they examined neural activity associated with particular kinds of judgments. In this case, judgments of acceptability. So whether it is acceptable or unacceptable to do X, Y, or Z. All right. So Greene and colleagues presented various dilemmas to their experimental participants, like trolley problems, and the crying baby dilemma as well. Let's take a look at the crying baby dilemma. You can follow along on page 51 of your textbook. I'll just read it to you now. Okay, here's the crying baby dilemma. Enemy soldiers have taken over your village. They have orders to kill all remaining civilians. You and some of your townspeople have sought refuge in the cellar of a large house. Outside, you hear the voices of soldiers who have come to search your house for valuables. Your baby begins to cry loudly. You cover his mouth to block the sound. If you remove your hand from his mouth, his crying will summon the attention of the soldiers who will kill you, your child, and the others hiding out in the cellar. To save yourself and the others, you must smother your child to death. Is it appropriate for you to smother your child in order to save yourself and the other townspeople? That's the crying baby dilemma. So Greene and his colleagues found that participants take a long time to respond to this one, and that's no surprise. But the most interesting part is that the responses are split fairly evenly between consequentialist judgments and deontological judgments. So about half of the participants say, yes, you've got to smother the baby, and another people say, no, it's never okay to smother a baby. Of course, Greene and his colleagues hypothesized that the deontological judgments being made in scenarios like this are being driven by affective responses, or prepotent affective responses. The consequentialist judgments, on the other hand, as you may have guessed, they hypothesized are driven by more deliberative, rational, or cognitive processes. So people who decide to smother the baby are overriding an initial emotional response here. It's a little bit different than what might be going on in the two variations of the push case, where we have an emotional alarm bell in the Footbridge case or the push case that overrides our consequentialist reasoning. Here, our alarm bell, the alarm bell isn't what's at play, rather. I mean, the people who deliver consequentialist judgments, one assumes, are overriding their alarm bell to deliver their consequentialist judgment, that is, to smother the baby. But these hypotheses generate a couple of predictions that we can subsequently test. So when presented with dilemmas like this, we should observe increased activity in dorsal subregions of the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. The anterior cingulate cortex reliably responds to incompatible behavioral responses, so we'll see activity there if we're, say, trying to decide between two things that are incompatible with one another. In this case, smothering a baby or not smothering a baby. Secondly, we should also observe increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's associated with, or rather activity in this area is associated with deliberation, conscious cognitive control, or what's often called executive functioning by psychologists and neuroscientists. So, what did Greene and colleagues find when they tested these predictions? Well, they observed that in difficult dilemmas, like the crying baby dilemma, more activity in the anterior cingulate cortex was elicited when compared to easy dilemmas. A dilemma that's easy might be something like, should you kill your boss just because you and your coworkers don't like him? For most of us, I would hope, this is an easy one because most of us would just say, no, you do not get to kill your boss. That would be morally wrong just because you don't like him. You have to deal with it. That's just how life is. Moreover, they also found that consequentialist judgments actually elicited more activity in areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which, as we've just seen, is important for executive function. That is, they elicited greater activity relative to the activity observed in the brains of people that offered deontological judgments to these kinds of dilemmas. So all of these taken together seem to support some kind of dual process model of moral psychology. But a lot of these results are largely observational. There's not really much going on other than presenting someone with either with a couple of different kinds of dilemmas, right? There's not much being manipulated otherwise in terms of independent variables. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I need to use my dual visual system and drink more coffee. Okay, so in a follow-up study, Greene and colleagues manipulated something called cognitive workload or cognitive load, basically giving your brain more to do, cognitively speaking, more to think about, more information to have to process, while exposing people to these dilemmas and seeing how they answer and what was going on in the brain when they give their answer. So Joshua Greene and his colleagues hypothesized that if they increase cognitive load, that ought to hinder, in some way, consequentialist judgments, because that means there's fewer cognitive resources to make consequentialist judgments with, because if we're giving you something else to do, using more of your working memory and executive function, you have less resources available to reason consequentialistly. So, Greene and colleagues found that when they increased the cognitive load, that slowed down the response time of consequentialist judgments. But it didn't slow people down when it came to offering deontological judgments. In fact, when people offered deontological judgments in response to these dilemmas, they were actually delivered a little bit faster than they were when cognitive load was not manipulated. However, it wasn't a statistically significant effect, so we can't really... So we can't really conclude anything especially meaningful from that. But what we can conclude is that increasing the cognitive load does seem to hinder our ability to offer these consequentialist judgments. All right, so if cognitive load and manipulating cognitive load affects the kinds of judgments that people make, what about manipulating people's affect? Well, Valdesolo and DeSteno, in a 2006 study, did an experiment where they showed people funny videos, like, say, a clip from Saturday Night Live, and they found that made people's judgments more consequentialist when judging personal dilemmas, like the push case. Why might this have happened? Well, my suspicion is that by inducing a positive affect or a positive emotional response by watching something funny, that may have somewhat offset the alarm bell that someone might have felt when faced with the decision of whether to push someone off of a bridge to their death. So perhaps this altered their affect in such a way that the alarm bell did not override their consequentialist response. What do you think? Let me know in the comments section. Similarly, Mendez and colleagues in a 2005 study found that patients who have frontal temporal lobe dementia, and these patients often exhibit blunted emotional responses, they endorsed pulling the lever in the switch case as well as pushing the large person off the bridge in the footbridge case, or push case, as I've been calling it. For similar reasons, I suppose. Perhaps a blunted emotional response means you're not going to have as strong of an emotional alarm bell, and you'll go with a consequentialist judgment instead. Let me know what you think in the comments section. But before you do, consider that this may have been because in frontotemporal lobe dementia, there's a deterioration of areas of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and this results in a deterioration of emotion processing, right? So this is the neurological nuts and bolts that I'm discussing now of what's going on. In fact, more generally speaking, studies on adults who have lesions in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, so not just dementia patients, but other patients who have had, say, acquired brain injuries or something like that. Studies with these adults also suggest that they judge what you or I would judge in deontological terms, that is personal cases, in consequentialist terms. So people with ventral medial prefrontal cortex lesions may deliver a consequentialist response to the push case and say it's perfectly acceptable to push the large person off the bridge to stop the trolley. And when we take all of this together, this seems to suggest that emotional responses or deontological responses depend on the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, whereas more cognitive or consequentialist judgments depend upon the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. It's interesting neuroscience there. And it's an interesting side note, something that I've been meaning to get to in the course of all of this discussion, and that is that if all of these results are accurate, or at least if they're suggestive of the way that our neural machinery really works when it comes to moral reasoning, this actually paints a picture of moral judgment that runs pretty counter to the philosophical tradition, which is very interesting. Consequentialist judgments, for example, tend to be associated more with the sentimentalist tradition, so relying on our feelings, our emotions to deliver or to tell us what is right and wrong. Deontological judgments, on the other hand, in the philosophical tradition, tend to be more associated with Kantian rationalism. So forget about your emotions. You just need the goodwill and the right principles, like different formulations of the categorical imperative, and you have to reason about what is right. If all of this empirical evidence is true, it actually suggests that philosophers have got this backwards. Deontological reasoning seems to be subserved by a more emotional reasoning, if you feel okay putting it that way. I do. In any case, deontological judgments, which have been considered by and large as very rational or cognitive, are driven by affect and intuition more than they are rational, deliberative, cognitive processes. And consequentialist judgments, which again traditionally have been associated with sentimentalists, are actually driven by cold, calculating, rational, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex type neural machinery or information processing in the brain. And that's very interesting that on the one hand, that this seems to be backwards in the philosophical tradition at any rate. And it's interesting because this is a great example of how this kind of interdisciplinary work can inform how we think about morality and our moral reasoning and our moral psychology. And this is why the interdisciplinarity of moral psychology is really exciting to me, because experimental evidence from neuroscience can inform philosophical theory, and philosophical theory can be used to formulate and test really interesting hypotheses in neuroscience. Very cool stuff, very exciting time right now in philosophy and in moral psychology more particularly. Anyway, so that about sums up all of the lines of evidence in the chapter that I want to discuss when it comes to this dual process model. And the long and short of it is that our moral psychology seems to be subserved by a more deliberative, conscious kind of system, together with a more affective kind of system. The conscious, deliberative kind of system seems to underwrite our consequentialist judgments, and the affective stuff seems to underwrite our deontological judgments. And now I want to move on to talk about intuition and affect in a little bit more detail and get into some more experimental stuff that would be fun to talk about and to see how that can inform philosophical reasoning and how philosophical principles and philosophical reasoning about morality might inform experimental work on our moral psychology. So let's get into that now by talking about intuition, affect, and something called the doctrine of double effect. All right, so moving on, talking about intuition and affect, why is it that the push case seems to elicit a stronger emotional response than the switch case, which doesn't seem to elicit much of a response, at least an emotional response, at all? Well, there's a couple ways we could answer this. We could, if we wanted to, try and describe the features of a particular moral dilemma, like the features of the switch case and footbridge or push case that reliably produce certain kinds of judgments about rightness and wrongness. And then we could try to work back and explain those judgments with reference to the cognitive processes at work behind them. But what we will do here, following the textbook, is actually begin with the philosophical literature. And in the philosophical literature, one of the most, I suppose, well-known explanations for the different judgments that people offer when presented with, contrasting cases like the switch case and the footbridge case is something called the Doctrine of Double Effect. And the Doctrine of Double Effect, or the DDE, basically says that it is impermissible to use harm as a means of achieving a greater good, but it is permissible to cause harm as a side effect of achieving the greater good. So think about the trolley problems again, the switch case and the push or footbridge case. In the switch case, harm is a side effect. So you pull the switch with the intention of bringing about this greater good, diverting the trolley and saving the 5 people. The trolley being diverted onto a track with one innocent person who is killed is a side effect of that. But in the push case, harm is used to directly bring about the greater good, and that is not permissible according to the doctrine of double effect. So maybe in terms of saying, at least in terms of people making judgments like it is okay to pull the switch but not okay to push the large person, well, maybe those people are applying something like the doctrine of double effect. Maybe that's what's going on. Well, another possibility, like I mentioned earlier, is that, of course, the push case just involves physical contact, right? Whereas the switch case does not. So the push case is personal and the switch case is impersonal. However, let's stick with the doctrine of double effect for now. See if we can make sense of what's going on by starting from this piece of philosophical literature and deriving some experiments from it to test what's happening. That's actually what Mikhail in a 2000 study does. He tries to see whether adherence to the doctrine of double effect or some similar principle will explain the judgments that people make in these sort of modified versions of the switch case, which we'll call loop cases. And I will, I'll show them here as I discuss them. But basically there are these two different cases, a means case and a side effect case. If you have your textbook out and you're following along, you can see this on page 56, figure 2.1. All right, so in both of these cases, there's a switch, you're standing beside it, and the switch will divert the trolley onto a sort of side track that kind of loops around, and it rejoins the other track before the trolley would have encountered the 5 innocent people on the main track. There's no physical contact because there's a switch. And there's direct intervention on the trolley and not on the victim in both cases. So there's no pushing people off of bridges here. It's all just pulling switches, getting the trolley to go on this loop track. And where these scenarios differ is what is on the loop track and what stops the trolley, basically. Okay, so in the means case, there is a large person on the loop track who is used as a means for stopping the trolley. And in the side effect case, there's a regular person, followed just after the person on the track, there is a large object, right, before the loop track rejoins the main track, as you can see in the images that I'll post here. Okay, so in the means case, you're pulling a switch, sending the trolley on this loop track, hitting a large person, which stops the trolley before it's able to rejoin the main track and kill the 5 innocent people. In the side effect case, the innocent person just happens to be standing in front of this heavy object, which is what will stop the trolley. That's why their death is a side effect in that case. And Mikhail found that the means case was reliably judged to be worse than the side effect case, morally speaking. And this seems to suggest that the doctrine of double effect could explain at least some of the differences in judgments between, differences in judgments that are offered for switch cases versus push cases. Because in the switch case, the person being killed is not a means being used to achieve some greater good. It's just their death is a side effect. Whereas in the push case or the Footbridge case, their death is a means to a greater good, and that is impermissible according to the doctrine of double effect. So maybe when harm occurs, or when there is the possibility that harm can occur, it's represented as being intentionally inflicted. That is, harm or the potential of harm is more likely to be perceived as being intentional or regarded as intentional if it's used as a means to an end, and rather than just merely a harmful side effect of something that's not in itself harmful, that's meant to bring about a greater good. Something similar when it comes to foreseen and unforeseen harms applies, by the way. People tend to judge a harm that is brought about as worse when it has been foreseen, that it's a possibility, versus when it's unforeseen. So for example, if I'm the head of some company and I pollute, I release some chemicals into the environment, people will judge that worse if I knew ahead of time how harmful those chemicals could have been, versus whether I just thought we've got to get rid of these chemicals, and it was thought that they would be safe for the environment, and we didn't realize that there were certain harms associated with their release into the environment. So that's one example of that kind of thing. But that might explain what's going on here. We can also ask here, since we're talking about intuition and affect, we should ask, is the application of the doctrine of double effect conscious? In other words, is it actually a principle that we're applying here? Or is it just something that nicely captures our intuitive responses to these kinds of moral dilemmas? Following the textbook and really this is kind of my own take on it as well, but I don't think the application of the doctrine of double effect is conscious. when we ask people in these kinds of studies, for example, to give principled reasons, they usually don't give principled reasons that mirror the doctrine of double effect to explain the judgments that they're offering, even though their judgments mirror the doctrine of double effect. So probably not consciously applying the doctrine of double effect here. This is something that Jonathan Haidt calls moral dumbfounding. Moral dumbfounding is really interesting. It refers to when we make principled, it refers to when we make moral judgments that we confidently regard as being correct, but when we're pressed to give a principled account for that judgment, we can't do it. So maybe something like that is going on here. I'm making intuitive affective judgments that may align with the doctrine of double effect, but if you were to ask me to give a principled account that, basically, if you were to ask me and see if I give you reasons that agree with the doctrine of double effect, that doesn't happen in these kinds of studies. So this is kind of like a case of moral dumbfounding, perhaps, although it's not the most compelling case of dumbfounding, if it is moral dumbfounding. And we will talk about moral dumbfounding more as we proceed through the course. It will come up again and again in future chapters. In any case, Haidt does think that moral dumbfounding occurs because a lot of the moral judgments that we make that are difficult to justify with rational principles are those kinds of intuitive judgments. So remember, an intuition is sort of rapid, automatic, unconscious judgment. And we just kind of make them unconsciously. So it's difficult to come up with principled accounts of our moral reasoning there because we're not being principled and deliberative when we're delivering those judgments. Further, research on all of this also seems to suggest that intuitive processes like those that might underwrite our deliverance of judgments in the switch case or the Footbridge case, or the two iterations of the loop case like the means case and the side effect case, these intuitive processes may be underwritten by affective or emotional processes. So it's the gut feeling, right? And again, this study is mentioned in this chapter, the very same study that I linked you to in our first full video lecture by Schnell and colleagues, where we have the dirty desk and the fart spray and all of this stuff. Basically, what the experimenters did in that experiment was show that by manipulating people's levels of disgust, they were able to, in turn, manipulate the severity of the moral judgments that they offered when presented with these various vignettes. And these judgments were pretty intuitive as well. So intuitive stuff may be underwritten by affective responses that we can actually manipulate by, say, increasing or decreasing levels of disgust or anger or compassion or other moral emotions. So that's very interesting. But anyway, all of this taken together seems to suggest that the processes that underwrite our moral judgments often operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. That's what makes them intuitive, right? Now, these unconscious processes can be captured by principles like the doctrine of double effect, but that doesn't mean that we're reasoning from principles here, right? The doctrine of double effect is a nice principle that captures the kinds of judgments that we make, but it's not necessarily the case that we're actually reasoning from that principle. It just does a nice job of describing the judgments that we do offer. Emotions, of course, when it comes to all of this intuitive stuff, likely play a causal role in our moral judgments. And we'll talk about emotions more in our chapter on moral motivation, and especially in our chapter on the moral emotions. So if any of this is not quite clear, just let me know in the comments section, and I can try and fill in the gaps as best I can before we move on to moral motivation and moral emotions in our next two lectures. And the same features, in any case, whether affective judgments are underwritten by or whether intuitive processes are underwritten by affective processes, or whether they just kind of seem to co-occur. it seems that whatever's going on, these two are very intimately related. And if it's not the case that our intuitive judgments are underwritten by affective processes, well, maybe there's some kind of similar underlying mental or neural machinery that explains both intuitive and affective judgments. The jury is still out on this, basically. Anyway, so that's it for intuition and affect. Why don't we move on to talk a little bit more about reasoning from deontological principles before wrapping things up. All right, so far in this long meandering tour through neuroscience and moral philosophy, we've seen that in contrast to the philosophical tradition, consequentialist judgments seem to be subserved, at least in general, by conscious deliberative processes, and deontological judgments seem to be subserved by unconscious intuitive processes. Again, unlike the philosophical tradition has it. So this distinction is complicated, though, and it doesn't necessarily hold in all cases. And that's important to talk about. One big example that's talked about here in the textbook, at least, is that certain kinds of reasoning, deontological reasoning, can lead to some pretty counterintuitive moral judgments, even in cases of deontological judgment. So even if we forget the fact that deontological judgment seems to be underwritten by an intuitive, affective sort of, those parts of the brain, those bits of the brain that are functionally organized such that they subserve intuition or affective responses. Even if we forget all that and put our Kantian rationalist hats on, we arrive at these weird counterintuitive moral judgments sometimes. Like Kant's claim that it would be wrong to lie to a would-be murderer that his victim is not in your house, right? If you're sheltering a potential victim of an axe murderer, and then you tell the murderer that he is in your house because it would be immoral to lie, well, that's kind of counterintuitive, right? Reason can also help us, in that case, it's hindering us, right? But in other cases, it can help us work out the role that our intuitions play in moral judgment, right? I mean, we can have a moral intuition that some action is wrong, right? But I might still perform X if I choose, right? That is conceivable. Perhaps I have this gut feeling, just to go back to my earlier shoplifting example, perhaps I have this gut feeling that stealing is wrong, and upon the thought of stealing, I have this visceral reaction against doing it. But then I might also be really, really hungry. Maybe I'm starving and I have to steal to feed myself. In that case, I might override my gut feeling and decide to steal a loaf of bread from a grocery store because, hey, it's a big giant grocery store. They're not going to miss it, and I don't want to go hungry, and perhaps my family doesn't either, so I should steal the bread. That's just one example. Don't steal bread from your local grocery store. All right, so consider again patients with ventral medial prefrontal cortex damage, those that we discussed earlier. So there are different kinds of scenarios that we can present people with ventral medial prefrontal cortex damage, like low conflict cases, like killing your boss, or the one we mentioned earlier, or the idea of throwing a baby in a dumpster to avoid the financial burden of raising the baby. This is a low conflict case because it's obvious. Don't throw the baby in the dumpster, right? It's very obvious what the right thing to do is. Likewise with killing your boss. Don't kill your boss just because you don't like your boss. A high conflict case, in contrast, might be the crying baby dilemma, where you have to deal with killing your own baby to save everyone, or not killing your own baby and letting everyone, including you and your baby, die. That's a very difficult decision to have to make. So that's a high conflict case. Now, in low conflict cases, patients with ventral medial prefrontal cortex damage respond that the action is perhaps almost certainly wrong, just like healthy participants do. So if I, say, present the dumpster baby or murdering your boss dilemma, they'll agree, yeah, that's easy, that's wrong. In high excuse me. So in the absence of emotional processing or intact emotional processing, perhaps these patients are just reasoning their way to a moral judgment, right? That's one possibility. Again, this goes for low conflict cases, not necessarily high conflict cases. There's other evidence that suggests that people can sometimes apply deontological principles in a kind of post hoc fashion, where we have an intuition about something, and it's a bit like a case of moral dumbfounding, except I make up a principled justification for my intuitive gut reaction. So if I have an intuition that action X is wrong, I might justify this by appealing to a deontological principle, do not do X, even though I arrived at my judgment that X is wrong using my intuition or perhaps my affect. So we can kind of rationalize, basically, to put it in everyday terms. We can rationalize our intuitive judgments and then give a principled account. But that doesn't mean that we were reasoning from principles. And this all highlights an important element of the dual process model of moral psychology, and that is that different psychological systems sometimes compete, and sometimes they interact in concert with one another. And we're still figuring out how this works. When these different systems compete with one another, why? When they work in concert with one another, why and how does that come about? And this is going to require a lot of empirical work in the future, and you never know. Maybe one of you will make some interesting discoveries when it comes to this stuff. Anyway, let's move on. Just briefly bring it back to affect for a little bit before we wrap up. All right, so the last subsection of this chapter is called the pervasive role of affect, and it highlights the role that affect plays not only in deontic reasoning, but also in consequentialist reasoning. And again, when we're talking about this, we'll also see that not only affect, but also principles play a role, not just in deontological reasoning, but also in consequentialist reasoning. So anyway, the authors kind of start here by pointing out that in consequentialism, the principles that are favored, or rather the general principles of consequentialism, tend to favor welfare maximizing behavior, and that this is of course supported by conscious and controlled behavior. In deontic reasoning, the principles have much more to do with the prohibition of harms, or the use of harm as a means to a greater good, but not as a means to an end. And of course, these are these seem to be underwritten by intuitive affective responses. So there are principles going on in both of these, not just deontology, but in consequentialism, principles do have a role to play as well. And the authors ask, how do these principles get into our heads at any rate? So take, for example, a welfare maximizing principle, something like, you've got to make sure that the net good is greater than the net harm. So we want to promote welfare, increase utility, all of that stuff. Here, affect, even though we're talking about a very consequentialist account, which, according to the philosophical tradition, is associated with sentimentalism, and according to neuroscience, is associated with conscious, deliberative reasoning, here, the author suggests that maybe affect does indeed play a role in consequentialist kinds of reasoning, and it could be that the role of affect here is to supply us with some sort of motivation to regard harm as actually being bad. Maybe though, the sort of pain and pleasure that we regard as intrinsically bad and intrinsically good don't count as emotions. That's something to consider. We'll talk more about whether, we'll talk more in future lectures about what the emotions actually are. But for now, let me know if you think that pain or pleasure count as emotions or count as affective states, as opposed to something like just body states or somatic states. In any case, let's grant that this is correct, and maybe affect supplies the motivation for consequentialists to regard harm as bad. Well, maybe what's going on is that our higher reasoning, our cold, deliberative, calculating brain is taking this value statement and generating a principle from it. A principle like act so as to minimize harm. That's a possibility. And if that's the case, then that shows us that affect can play a role both in deontological and in consequentialist reasoning. In fact, the authors discuss the possibility that there might be two different kinds of emotional responses involved in different kinds of moral judgments. There might be ones that act like alarm bells, which we see in the deontic justifications that people give for not pushing the large man off of the footbridge to stop the trolley. But there might also be emotions that are kind of currency-like. So the alarm bell emotions would here help to circumvent reasoning and place certain constraints on our behavior, like pushing large people off of bridges to stop trolleys. Currency emotions might play a role in more deliberative kinds of reasoning and provide like motivations or standing desires not to engage in certain behaviors and to engage in other behaviors, which of course we would regard as morally bad and morally good, respectively. So alarm bell emotions probably underwrite our deontic judgments, as we've seen. We've considered abundant lines of evidence for that in today's lecture. And currency-like emotions might underwrite our consequentialist judgments. So, oh, hello. Hi, come on. Hi, come on. Hi. Oh, how are you doing? How are you doing? Hi. So alarm bell type emotions might underwrite our deontological judgments, but currency-like emotions might underwrite consequentialist judgments. So alarm bell emotions might give rise to principles like harm is bad, and from there, reason can take over. And basically, we can use our reason to deliberate how to respond to a particular moral dilemma by perhaps weighing other intuitive or affective responses against cognitive principles to work out what the right thing to do actually is. So maybe in the push case, the physical contact or the doctrine of double effect might elicit some kind of strong response, and we just kind of feel it viscerally. We feel in our gut that pushing the person off of the bridge to stop the trolley would be wrong. In the switch case, we still experience this emotional alarm, but because of other utilitarian considerations, we deliberate. Maybe currency-like emotions, like play a role in telling us that pleasure or happiness or eudaimonia or whatever is intrinsically good, and that saving 5 people would increase the net utility in the world, and so we arrive at a consequentialist judgment. Then again, not everyone responds to these dilemmas in the same way. Most people agree that it's wrong to push the person off the bridge, and that it's okay to pull the switch. But some people think that it's okay to pull the switch and push the person off the bridge, and some people think it's best to do nothing and let the 5 people die in each case, rather than be responsible to one degree or another for an innocent bystander's death. And certainly this is something I've noticed in the variety of responses I got to the trolley dilemmas I talked about in my earlier lecture. So thank you all, by the way, who answered. That was very interesting, and I hope that this discussion has helped to explain why people offer different judgments when it comes to these different scenarios. All right, so let's wrap things up now. So in light of all of the empirical findings that we've talked about today, it isn't really sensible to ask whether moral judgment is underwritten by an exclusively affective system or an exclusively cognitive kind of system. Instead, as the authors state on page 66, moral judgment is the product of a complex interaction between multiple psychological systems. Just as my identifying this coffee cup and reaching for it is the result of a complex interplay between two visual systems, or two systems for different kinds of visual information processing, my moral judgments seem to be underwritten by the interaction of an affective intuitive system and a conscious cognitive reasonable system, if you put it that way. The affective intuitive system seems to subserve reasoning which prohibits certain kinds of harms, and the consequentialist system seems to favor welfare maximizing principles. So different kinds of moral reasoning going on here, underwritten by different kinds of what I've been calling mental machinery. Now, this chapter has looked primarily at physical harm, and the authors are, of course, very clear about the fact that there are a lot of ethical domains that require further investigation when it comes to multi-system moral psychology. So, for example, the authors have had nothing to say about harms done to the environment or to non-human animals or to the fair distribution of resources, or even to things like different kinds of taboos, like food taboos or sexual taboos. So there's a lot of work yet to be done on multi-system moral psychology and how it might explain things in these other domains rather than how it explains our judgments about under what circumstances it's okay to cause physical harm. So there's a lot of work yet to be done, and you guys right now in this class are actually in a pretty interesting position because this is still a young field, and it's possible that in a few years, if some of you decide to go to graduate school, you might decide to investigate this kind of thing. And who knows, you might help fill in some of these blanks when it comes to multi-system moral psychology and these other ethical domains. So that's it for today. In the next chapter, that's chapter 3, and that's all about moral motivation. So we'll talk a little bit about moral motivation. Stay tuned, of course, to See You Learn. I will have something to say about office hours shortly, and I will also be making the the next quiz available once this video is uploaded. And I'll give you a little bit of extra time to do it because what with the long weekend and everything, it did take me a little more time than I would have liked to have gotten this lecture done. Anyway, I hope you're all staying safe out there. I hope you are all reading the textbook and enjoying the material. I know some of the stuff in here can be a little bit dry sometimes, and I hope to bring out the exciting parts of it in these lectures for you. By the way, because this was a very interdisciplinary kind of lecture, if you feel like there's any component, whether it's a philosophical component or perhaps a neuroscientific component that you don't feel like you fully understand, let me know in the comments or send me an email and I will do my best to clarify things for you. But otherwise, I will see you next time when we'll discuss moral motivation. Bye for now.